This is Zeus reporting from Station Olympus. A few messages. Hermes is to go to Natick to pick up some frank messages. And now the weather report. Boreas will blow from his usual direction. Helios will drive his chariot across the sky again today. And the Pleiades will not weep today. Newsflash. Demeter is still searching for her daughter. Persephone has just eaten a pomegranate seed, and Hermes will go to Hades to interview her. Heracles is on his 12th labor, and Theseus is on his way home after a successful venture on Crete. Station Olympus, over and out.
I better explain that really strange message you just heard. At Kennedy Middle School here in Natick, the vice principal, John Hughes, is very interested in mythology. And this is the kind of a message he will broadcast to certain select classes. One of the classes that he will give messages like this to is Kathy Catanay's 8th grade English class, particularly when they're about to start their mythology unit. I have called today's show Mythology Experts, and I would like to introduce the experts right now. First of all, we have Dr. Bob Wilhelm, classics professor from the University of Miami, and Kathy Catanay, the 8th grade English teacher at Kennedy, and our student experts, Bronwyn, Teresa, Kristen, Matt, and Chris. Now, I'm going to start out with the question. How did you get interested in mythology?
Well, I guess I got interested in it because my parents always read Greek myths to me when I was a youngster, oh, so many years ago. But I think I really studied it formally, first of all, in the 9th grade when I went to high school. And we had a whole course on classical mythology, which was taught by the English teacher. And that was my real first introduction, I think, to the ancient myths. The books that we read were really quite exciting. And we had to write papers and term reports, and we even had a sort of dress-up day where we all came as our favorite god or goddess. And that was really, I think, the beginning where I started.
And how did you get started?
Basically, I recovered from my high school experience. And when I was presented with having to teach Greek mythology, I knew I didn't know enough to teach without doing some research on my own, and found out that mythology wasn't as dry and as dull as it had been presented to me, and in fact it was quite exciting and risque and adventurous, and decided that perhaps if I approached with the lowbrow approach instead of a highbrow approach, that we could all be interested.
And how did you kids get interested in mythology? What was the...
Well, for me, it was just Miss Caddy. I'd never experienced anything like this before, so it was her.
And when she started telling the stories like they were happening on television, it really got you hooked, huh? Yeah. Anybody else? Some of you'd studied it before, right? This was not your... What about you, Matt? Where did you start?
Mrs. Young's in 5th grade. She had some on it.
She always likes to work it in. And you know a lot about mythology,
well,
Chris.
I really don't remember a specific time when I started, but once I took out a book from the library, I think it was, and all the Myth stuff I started just to read was really interesting. So I just sort of stuck to it and kept reading about it. And then this year, she's really got me interested in it with the project we did, everything else.
Anybody else? Anything? Oh, when I started in ninth grade, I do remember we had to read the Odyssey, and I'd read some books of mythology, but not continually. I wasn't that hooked. But when I was in college, I took a really fascinating course. It was just a semester, and a lot of the students thought, oh, mythology, it's going to be a real easy course. Well, I had a professor who made sure that it wasn't a gut, as you well know. And I really enjoyed the study that we had there. And we had plays in college that they did in Greek outside in the amphitheater. And you could see that in the spring. It's right over here at Wellesley College. So that's how I got started in it. Why don't we talk a little bit about why you think it's important to have mythology in the schools?
Well, I think there are a wide variety of reasons. I suppose one of the things is that it deals with sort of universal things, universal patterns, universal themes, and it introduces you to a wide variety of literature and art and music. I mean, if you go to a museum, you're going to see mythological paintings, or you listen to even contemporary rock groups like The Bread and so on have, and Hemispheres have songs and stories that deal with mythological subjects. And unless you know the background to this, you will miss many of the allusions, many of the associations. And I also think it helps when you're reading something like Shakespeare or other types of poetry that you catch these mythological allusions. You can't pick up a newspaper or a magazine or read the New Yorker or understand the cartoons there unless you have experienced this mythological background.
And what's your message?
Well, my message, I guess, is my personal philosophy, and that's you have to get kids interested in something first before you let them know how important it is as literature. You have to get them to like it first, and to get to know the characters as people, as they can relate to them. And I think we do that.
I think there's sort of two parts to mythology. There's like the good news and the bad news for teachers. The good news is that kids will really like mythology because you all really enjoy these stories. But the other side of it is that if you're going to try to teach it, you really have to know about it. You have to do your research. You can't just get some workbook and pass it out and say, well, now we've done mythology. I've been very impressed with the project that your class came up with. They published this magazine called Mythological Monthly. And we have here the three editors of the magazine, Kristen and Teresa and Bronwyn. And we discovered in our lunchtime discussion that what did that primarily mean? Being an editor. It sounds really neat.
Putting the whole thing together.
And
We had all the information, and we had to put it into and compose a magazine out of all the stories that were written.
But you had a lot of physical work to do, right? Like,
Yes.
what color were your fingers?
Purple.
Purple. Yes. Yes. Okay. Everyone in your class had to contribute to this magazine.
Right.
All right. And we read in depth the contributions of these six. When I attended the Mythology Institute last summer, one of the first things that we learned is that myth is flexible, and that you can take a story and bend it in a lot of different ways and emphasize different aspects of it. And two of these authors here wrote about the same myth. They both wrote about Pegasus. Why don't you just quickly give a recap of Pegasus, because though we're saying we're experts, we can't expect everybody who's watching this.
Well, Pegasus is a mythological horse who has a rider named Bellerophon, and the two of them pair up and they engage in a lot of adventures. Pegasus is the individual whose hoof strikes the earth and produces the Hippocrene fountain, which is the fountain of poetic inspiration. They become involved with the Chimera in a wonderful adventure story. And he exhibits, I suppose, the story of Pegasus and Bellerophon exhibit man's attempt to get away from the earth, to seek new heights, to fly, to go on a journey, to be creative.
Now, in this magazine, Bronwyn and Chris wrote about, Matt wrote about Pegasus. However, they took two very different approaches. You wrote about, what was your approach?
My approach was more about the horse and his adventures and how he was made, and more about him, not about him with anyone else. But I mean, anyone who was with him was included, not just one person.
And why did you decide to write about Pegasus?
Well, I'd heard other stories about him, and I was interested in horses and things like that. And I wanted to figure out like the real story about
The truth
Pegasus.
about Pegasus. And that's a real approach that a girl would have, because girls like horses a lot. And then you wrote a story called The Boy and His Horse. And why did you pick this approach?
Well, Pegasus is the flying horse, and he had an owner, which was Bellerophon, and I just wanted to know about what they did together, not just what Pegasus did. And so I did it on Bellerophon too, and what they did together.
There was also another reason why you wanted to explore this. You saw a movie.
Well, yes,
right?
I saw a movie, Clash of the Titans, and it had takeoffs on all the myths combined into one movie. And I wanted to really know what really happened, or what the truth was in the myth, not what the movie said. Because with Mrs. Catney, we're learning what really happened, what the myths are about, and then thinking back on Clash of the Titans, it's completely different. And I wanted to know what really did happen with the flying horse Pegasus.
They even had Perseus,
Yeah, they had Perseus flying the horse.
which is, myth is flexible, but maybe it's not.
Do you think
quite
that was wrong to have? I mean, why do you think Pegasus was?
Well,
why did they pick Pegasus?
Perseus was his own person, and he never got involved, as far as I know. He never had anything to do with Pegasus, and Bellerophon did. So I wanted to put the two people that belong together in my story, and that's what I did.
But part of the idea of myth being flexible is that you can be creative in a poetic or visual way, and there may be some reason in that particular movie why Perseus was connected with the horse, to get some sort of message or symbolism across. It doesn't mean that it's wrong, and this is the idea of myths changing over time. Myths are very flexible. They are updated. One poet can treat it this way, another poet can treat it that way, and myth gets reshaped, recycled, transformed is the idea, and they're fluid, in other words.
Now, Matt wrote about Chris, name tags, wrote about another hero story, but you were more interested in what aspect of the...
I wrote, excuse me, a story about the Minotaur, which is half man, half bull. I mostly was focused on the creature, the Minotaur, because when I started, I've heard about it and stuff, and also I saw some movie where it had the Minotaur in it, but it didn't have anything to do with mythology. So I just really did that report, and Theseus, he was the hero in that story. I included him because he was part of the story. He wasn't necessarily one of my main characters. The Minotaur was.
Do you want to... The title of your story was What Lurks in the Labyrinth. Do you want to give a quick capsule for those who don't know all the details of the Minotaur?
The Minotaur was an offspring of a man, this is going to sound pretty awkward, but a woman and a bull and a love affair. And it was, it was too fierce a creature to just have it run around, so they put it in this large maze called the labyrinth, and it was just too complicated to get in. The whole purpose of it was to keep the Minotaur in, and anybody else who would try to harm the thing, to keep it out of there. Every 7 years, the reason that Theseus went there because he wanted to save the people from being destroyed because they would be sacrificed to the Minotaur.
And then Theseus killed the Minotaur.
Yes, he volunteered to go as one of the people who would be sacrificed, and while he was in there, he slayed the Minotaur.
I noticed that you included that picture of the Minotaur sort of staring out at the sea.
Mm-hmm.
That's really lovely.
Thank you.
A really rather pathetic
Yeah.
sort of searching picture it was. Did you come across any place where, it's certainly on the island of Crete where this took place, but did you connect the labyrinth with any specific place on the island of Crete? Did you connect it with a palace? Do you remember the palace?
No, I don't.
King Minos's palace, which is the palace of Knossos, which is really like a labyrinth.
Mm-hmm.
And there are no straight passageways, and it's very difficult to get inside. And they think that in that particular story, it's based upon saga or some historical place, and that the labyrinth is actually the palace. And the reason for the labyrinthine way was so that it was a protective device to keep people out. So if somebody came to the palace, they wouldn't be able to get in easily, and they'd need to be taken in by the people at the palace. And the other thing that you mentioned about every 7 years they had to go, and Theseus went with 7 girls and 7 boys. They had to sacrifice. This is, at least in historical fact, we connect this with the fact that Crete was under the political control of Athens, and that the 7 girls and the 7 boys were booty or tribute that Athens had to send every year, or every so many years, to them. And so when Theseus went, this reflects the fact that of Athens coming out from under power of Crete, at least in the historical world.
And also the Minotaur could really be sort of explained as just a man wearing a bull's mask.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the pictures, it's pretty obvious that you could just put the mask on.
And actually on the island of Crete, they celebrated bull games, in which a man actually, they think, a man or the king, dressed up with this bull's head on, and he participated in this ritual. It was a sort of fertility rite to encourage the fertility of the soil. And he put this on, and they celebrated these bull games or these bull dances right in the center of the palace. There's a great big courtyard there. And the idea was to grab a hold of the horns of the bull and jump up and fly over the horse's or the bull's back and land on your feet. So that this gets turned, these historical things get turned into wonderful sort of mythological stories.
And there are real frescoes showing this
And there
bull
are real
dancing.
frescoes.
Maybe, you might want to look for those pictures. Okay, for something that was very different, we had some hero stories. And then Kristen did like a column where readers wrote in questions about the gods. And the title of your column was sort of interesting. What was that?
Ask Avida.
Ask Avida. How did you come up with that name?
Well, I was leafing through the back of a book and it had Greek and Roman poets, and one of them was Ovid, so I changed it to Avida because I'm a girl.
Yeah. And what were some of the questions they ask you?
Like who is Vulcan and did Cronus really eat his children? And about Eros.
Did Cronus really eat his children?
Yes, he did.
Oh.
He was all fed up with them, in other words.
But that was a very creative way of doing the assignment. Yeah.
Did a good job.
Yeah. Teresa did something that was very good. You took two versions of the flood story and compared them. And most people know the story of the flood that's in the Bible with Noah and the ark and the animals 2 by 2. But could you tell us the other flood story very briefly?
Well, the other flood was was kind of the same idea, because Zeus, the god in the sky, was looking over his people, and they had just turned very bad, and they weren't loving each other, and they were just very evil. And so he decided to punish them with showers of rain to create this huge flood and drown all of the people. But then one man came to him and said, well, there are these two good people who did nothing evil at all, so why drown them, you know? So Zeus sent them up on top of a mountain where they wouldn't be harmed by the flood, and everyone else were drowned in the flood except those two good people. And they repopulated the earth and created all goodness again for the earth. So
That was just really interesting that you compared two stories, one from Greek mythology, and your story had some interesting details, and it sent us right to the texts, and we were checking out some of the details, the different kinds of wood that it said in the Bible that Noah used to make the ark. You had teak wood from the Bible that you used, and the Bible that I was checking, it said gopher wood or something like that. And then there was some other interesting genealogical
Yes, you had
changes
you had the daughter of, or the Pyrrha was whose daughter?
now I think it's Pandora's daughter.
But you had Persephone, and as we talked a little bit earlier, I was trying. I mean, this is again part of the idea of the flexibility of myth, where depending upon who is the parent, creates a kind of different impression in terms of symbols or significance. Whether if Persephone is the mother, then the symbolism associated with Pyrrha is quite different than if you have Pandora as the mother. Did you, when you did your research, did you how did they repopulate the earth? You said they repopulated the earth. Do you remember what they did? Or what were they told to do?
They went to the gods for help because they really didn't know what to do now that no one else was around. So the gods told them that, well, actually they gave them kind of like a little kind of
Riddle.
I don't know, yeah, riddle. And they said, cast the bones of your mother behind you. So that stumped them for a minute. But then they thought about it, and they came to the conclusion that that it meant that
The stone.
A bigger mother.
Pick up the
The
stone.
bigger mother. And who was their real mother?
that was the earth.
The earth.
So they cast these stones behind them,
yes,
and they turned into men and women.
depending upon who threw them. When
Yeah.
Pyrrha threw them over, they turned into women.
Yes.
And Deucalion threw them over, they turned into men.
Now, Matt Burwell did something completely different. He did a study of Norse mythology, which I guess you really like a lot. Why don't you take like two Norse gods and compare them to some of the Greek gods?
Well, Thor's a lot like Hercules. They both like to fight a lot, and they usually always win. And Tyr is a lot like Mars. They're both war gods, and they like to kill people and pillage and plunder and stuff like that.
And you said that you think that the Norse gods are kinder than the Greek gods, because if the Greek gods help you, they always want something in return.
Yeah, like a sacrifice or something. But the Norse gods, they just helped people a lot, and they're a lot kinder.
Maybe you ought to think of a kinder, gentler mythology next year. Well, are there any questions that have come up as you've been thinking about mythology that you just couldn't put it all together? And possibly we can get some sort of an answer as to how it all fits together. One of the questions that I was thinking of is that at what point did they the ancient Greeks really get the idea of a whole family of gods? I had the feeling that there were a lot of different local gods. And when did they all sort of get in the family?
Well, I suppose the official sort of genealogy of the gods that was produced was in the 8th century BC by the poet Hesiod, who did something that's called the Theogony, in which becomes the sort of official genealogy of the Greeks. And of course it's in Homer too. But this happens over a long period of years. I mean, Zeus comes into the Greek world about 2000, and over the next 1,000 years or so, these various gods come in, and then they eventually come into this genealogical form.
You talked a little bit about how exciting it is to have someone for the students to see who spends his whole life on mythology. I mean, you did one unit and it's done, but you go on forever and ever. How important do you think that is?
I do think it's important. I think that kids, especially kids being introduced to a whole new world, have to know that if you can be passionate about something and really love something, whether it's Greek mythology or Norse mythology or math, but whatever it is they're passionate about, that it can become a life's love and a life's work at the same time. That it doesn't have to be, you know, a hobby. It can be your life's work and your life's passion. That's really important to know.
Any comments you have about this passion?
Yes, I think I think that's very true. That it becomes sort of an obsession, but it provides you with enjoyment. And it is something that, you know, when you're sitting in front of a computer, or you're in a chemistry class, or you're in a business course or something, you can sit back and it's part of one's intellectual stimulation here. I think that it provides you with a broad base and an appreciation of the arts and the literature and the music. And this is very important. And I think you're right that there's a kind of role model. I mean, it's good for people to see people who devote their whole life to teaching a mythology course.
Well, thank you very much for providing your insight and your expertise. Thank all of you. And I hope we've shared some of our excitement with all of the viewers.